The period from the end of World War I in 1918 to the beginning of the Second World War is known as the Interwar period. The dating on this period is difficult because the war started in Asia significantly earlier than fighting in Europe, and the United States entered the war later than almost all other participants. So we can date the beginning of World War II at 1931 with Japan's invasion of Manchuria, or 1938 when Japan attacked China, or with the 1939 invasion of Poland by Germany and the USSR, but the war was well underway before the United States joined in December of 1941. We will divide our discussion of the interwar period into two sections. This one covers the era from 1918 to 1929, and the next presentation will deal with the 1930s. After World War I, diplomats attempted to find peaceful ways to address disputes. By 1930s, economic woes, disputes over treaties, political ideologies made states return to cutthroat competition. And then World War II, from 1937 to 1945, occurred. It was the most efficient killing machine in history, where technology combined with the concept of total war to devastate the globe. The 1920s saw a world weary of war. The death tolls of World War I were staggering, up to 9 million people killed on the battlefields alone, and perhaps as many as 19 million killed overall. Economic costs were destructive to the winners and the losers both, and the death tolls were so high for the fighting group that an entire generation of people was lost, leading to a return to political leadership of the older generation, or a very, very young generation with almost no experience. This meant Europe was hobbled in its choices from the very beginning. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, set out in a special speech on the way to peace and what it might look like, provided a positive enough view that Germany in 1918 decided to ask Wilson to begin negotiations. As we saw in an earlier lesson, this eventually led to a ceasefire on November 11, 1918 at 11:11 a.m. Germany and its allies then withdrew their armies from the battlefield and began drawing them down as they waited for an invitation to peace talks. These are the 14 points on this slide. Point 1, there should be no secret treaties among nations. 2, freedom of the seas should be maintained for all. 3, tariffs and other economic barriers among nations should be lowered or abolished for free trade. 4, arms should be reduced to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety, thus lessening the possibility of military responses during diplomatic crises. 5, colonial policies should be considered the interests of the colonial peoples as well as the interests of imperial powers. 6, the evacuation of Russian territory by invading forces. 7, Belgium must be evacuated and restored. 8, all French territory must be restored and freed. Crimes committed by Germany must be settled, namely crimes done by Prussia in 1871 in the matter of Alsace-Lorraine needs to be reconciled in order for peace. Number 9, Italy's borders should be readjusted based upon lines of nationality. 10, Austria-Hungary's peoples need to be afforded freedom. 11, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro should be evacuated and restored. 12, Turkish portions of the Ottoman Empire should be granted secure sovereignty. 13, an independent Polish state should be erected. And 14, the call for the League of Nations. This would become an international organization that would address crises like the one that sparked the war. So these 14 points are in order the ideas that set up the international order that we live in today, a set of ideas that are proposals for adjustments of borders and creation of a lasting peace in Europe, and finally the idea of an international forum like the League of Nations. One of the events that had led toward the end of the war was the coup d'etat in Russia, through which Lenin and the Bolsheviks took power. But Russians did not just give in to this military takeover. Several generals from the Russian army and a number of Russian aristocrats were joined by middle and lower class Russians, creating a so-called White Russian army in opposition to the Red Russians, the communists, under Lenin and Trotsky. Fearful of communism, a number of states, including the United States, Great Britain, and Japan, sent soldiers to Russia to help fight Lenin's Red Army. At the same time, in 1919, the Paris Peace Conference was held. Negotiations were long and led to several treaties between the Allied powers and each of the states on the side of Germany. Initially, the treaties, it would hoped, would be based on the new internationalist agenda set up by Wilson in his 14-point speech. However, the concern by France to prevent another attack by Germany and the needs of Britain and France and other allies to recharge their treasuries, in part to pay back huge loans from the United States and Japan, led to hard negotiations that did not live up to the internationalist standards of Wilson. Eventually, Wilson was willing to negotiate away nearly all of his ideals in order to win passage of his most cherished notion, the League of Nations, a collective security organization that was to help solve disputes without military force. The Treaty of Versailles was particularly hard on Germany, which was not a part of the negotiations but was forced to sign. Germany was required to sign Clause 231, which suggested strongly that Germany bore the majority of responsibility for the war. The reparations payments that would be required of Germany were not set out in this treaty. Instead, Germany agreed to payments at whatever level a committee of assessors would choose by 1921. That number eventually reached somewhere between 112 billion and 132 billion gold Deutschmarks. Germany also agreed to limit the size of its army and reduce weaponry, as well as to sink its powerful fleet of naval vessels and minimize its air force. Germans saw this as extremely unfair and remained angry about it throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The League of Nations was created, but it was created without the United States as a member. President Wilson actually died of a stroke as he was traveling the United States by train, trying to convince Americans to convince their senators to ratify the treaty that included the League of Nations. Eventually, the League of Nations started with 42 charter members. 26 of them were non-European. It did have some successes. It helped to prevent minor conflicts in some areas, including in Africa, and it also created the world's first global vaccination program, which helped lead to the end of polio. But it was also unable to enforce its decisions about fighting and territorial control, partly because the United States' absence limited the possibility of peacekeeping success. So it was unable to control major conflicts. In Russia, Lenin successfully won the war against the White Russian resistance and set about creating his new government. He had several problems, however. Russian industrialization was not far advanced, and the cost of World War I had led to a drastic economic downturn. By 1921, nearly 80% of Russians were unemployed, so in order to build up his economy and industrial infrastructure such that it could support the revolution, Lenin resorted to a temporary program known as the New Economic Program. In it, he allowed Russians to maintain ownership of their land, operate privately owned businesses, and keep profit for themselves, something very against his beliefs as a collectivist. The plan worked, though, and by 1925, Russia was coming out of its Great Depression. In this map, you can see how Europe looked in 1919 at the end of the First World War. Many changes were on the way. Already, it is possible to see the breakup of the Austrian Empire into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. It's also possible to see a reconstituted Poland between Germany and the USSR, which was one of Wilson's goals. France, after the punishment of World War I, was interested in absolute security by 1919. Its population and economy were in a long decline relative to those of Germany, and historical experience of German invasions in 1872 and 1914 led to fears that France could not stop such an invasion if it came. So France's policy was twofold. One, to keep Germany weak. To do this, France demanded large reparations payments that would help the French economy and prevent Germany from completely recovering from the war. Second, France built the Maginot Line, which you can see in the pictures, a series of underground reinforced concrete forts with gun emplacements and underground railways for moving soldiers and munitions in order to stop Germany if it tried another invasion. The French policy of blaming Germany for the war and requiring draconian reparations payments raised German anger, and it divided France's former allies, many of whom agreed with the American view that helping Germany reintegrate into the world trade system would make Germany less likely to go to war. France refused to follow this line of thinking. As the largest power on the European continent west of Germany, France was thus the leader of Europe, but appears to have been unwilling to lead and more interested in simply building barriers and waiting behind them. As noted above, the so-called war guilt clause, not completely inaccurately, blamed Germany for most of the destruction of the war. This provided the legal basis for the massive reparations payments required of Germany, which hobbled its economy and so reduced German employment. No matter what their political positions, Germans almost universally hated this clause of the treaty and remained angry about it throughout the interwar period. One of Germany's primary goals throughout the 1920s and 30s was to revise these treaty requirements. In 1922, Germany and Russia, former enemies but now both pariahs in Europe, began to take some steps toward reconciling with each other in the Rapallo Treaty. This treaty simply normalized relations between the two states and made clear that both would like to see a revision in the borders of Poland. That normalization was important, though both states were largely cut out of world trade, Germany because of its status as the biggest aggressor during the war, and Russia because of its communist government. Their ability to trade and eventually to share manufacturing and military training activities was seen by the United States and Great Britain as steps towards the normalization of Germany's position in the world. France was not pleased, but was unable to do anything about the reconciliation. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, France depended on unilateral diplomacy to keep itself safe, not trusting the League of Nations. In 1923, after Germany missed one of its required reparations payments of $21 billion, France, without notice, unilaterally sent soldiers into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, to occupy. The goal was to take the profit of the German factories in the Ruhr Valley in lieu of Germany's missed payment. The German government paid the workers in these factories not to go to work, so as to stymie France's attempt. This cost Germany tremendously, and to make the wage payments, the government printed extra money. That printing led to massive inflation, which caused an economic depression in Germany. However, the ploy worked, and France in 1932, having not made any profit on its occupation, eventually left the Ruhr region. In 1925, an attempt to put the disputes of the early 1920s behind them and guarantee the peace of Europe, a number of European states created the Locarno Pact. In it, France, Germany, Great Britain, and Italy guaranteed the existing borders of European states. They established a demilitarized zone 30 miles deep on the east bank of the Rhine River, and all agreed to refrain from aggression against each other. This led to a sense of security in Europe and a new hopefulness that peace and economic prosperity would return. The optimism was even given a name. It was called the Spirit of Locarno. In the Spirit of Locarno, the Ministries of State for the United States and France drew up a treaty known for their last names, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This treaty, eventually signed onto by every major global power, outlined war as a tool of foreign policy and called for total disarmament among all states. Without an enforcement clause, the treaty depended upon the goodwill and commitment of all its signatories, and so was not effective in ending war, but the idea and the attempt were greeted with great enthusiasm when the treaty was signed in 1928. Here's a map of Europe in 1925, and these are the borders that the Locarno Treaty guaranteed. Lenin died in 1925. At the time, the system of leadership to be followed in the USSR was not clear. Lenin had led the revolution, but the communists were divided as to whether to rule by committee or give power to lead the revolution to a single successor to Lenin. Joseph Stalin, a low-level Communist Party functionary who eventually came to lead the Human Resources branch of the Communist Party, was able to use his connections, despite deathbed warnings from Lenin that he should not be leader, to become General Secretary of the Communist Party and chairman of the party's ruling committee, the Politburo. This gave him the power he needed to make himself dictator. He quickly rid himself of rivals, even sending an assassin all the way to Mexico to get rid of Trotsky. He then set to addressing the other key political issue, whether the Russian Communist Party should work to bring a workers' revolution to the world, as Marx had suggested would happen, and to which Lenin was committed. Stalin settled on a policy of nurturing communism in Russia because he felt that there were too many enemies in the world at the time and feared that Russia might be crushed if it extended itself too far internationally. This cautious conservative policy he called socialism in one country. Stalin also engaged in requiring the kulaks, that is middle-class landowning farmers like the ones that you see in this photograph here on the top left, to give up their land and their animals and become part of collective farms. He set up 5-year plans which set economic goals for the Soviet Union and required those goals to be met. And he also used his early version of the KGB, it was known as the NKVD at the time, to enforce his policies and make sure that there was no dissent in Russia. In fact, Joseph Stalin is responsible directly for more deaths than any other person in the 20th century, including Adolf Hitler. By the 1930s, it was clear that both the winners and the losers of World War I were suffering while reconstructing themselves. The winners were also responsible to keep the peace in Europe. This, it turned out, was too expensive, and the winners began to take the least expensive and least risky ways possible to achieve their goals. The losers of World War I, increasingly moving toward dictatorship and aggression, saw this as weakness and as opportunity. And that's where we'll go next when we look at the 1930s.